We're going to talk about imperialism today, jingoism, Cuban War of Independence, power of sugar, yellow journalism, all those sorts of things. So uh, please do send an emoji so that I know you're here or something, or a hi. That would be great. Because again, I can't see. My Twitch stats say 0 viewers and 740 views. So I don't have no idea what that means. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We are we're getting past the area that I'm most familiar with, which is economics, and into the realm of imperialism, where I'm kind of familiar with the debates, but have sort of ambivalent ideas about precisely what's going on. I've been following a lot of the literature, reading a lot of the literature about this, and so I want to kind of give you a sense of what's going on, and some ideas, sort of new ideas about race, technology, and empire that undergird what's going to become the U.S. acquisition of Cuba and the Philippines, which are kind of bloody and ugly, but also going to give you a sense of some of the reasons for intervention that are not increasingly obvious, and also some sort of ideas about race that are floating around in this period. So let's start with Lewis Henry Morgan. Lewis Henry Morgan is one of these people who we talked about the sort of growing taxonomy and sort of science via taxonomy, so that the periodic table, Mendeleev lays out the periodic table and he says, wow, there seem to be 35 elements missing. I believe those elements exist, and eventually they'll be discovered. And sure enough, all 35 elements are ultimately discovered. So there's this similar kind of application of taxonomies and the separation of the world into stages and orders that Lewis Henry Morgan engages in. And lest you think this is just a sort of conservative ideology, this is the ideology that conservatives use, but it's also the ideology that liberals use and Marxists use. I mean, Marx himself viewed Lewis Henry Morgan as a great innovator. Most Marxists follow along in this tradition, so we can't. It's almost kind of he betrays or shows us a kind of way of thinking about the world that we would be uncomfortable with in the 21st century, but people were quite comfortable with, particularly in Europe, in the 19th century. And what he did is he distinguished between the arts of subsistence, and then he in different communities, and he looks for technology as distinctive markers of civilization. So speech and fire and the shaping of flint and pottery, domestication of animals and writing, he sees them as ranked and cumulative. So iron tools, but no writing means that you can domesticate plants. And then civilization is a sort of count of the number of those elements. If you've ever played the game Civilization, you know what I'm talking about. Civilization is basically Lewis Henry Morgan's classification of the world based on these individual nuggets of technology, right? So and civilization is really a count of the number of these elements. So the agrarian Bronze Age is the middle stage of barbarism. The pre-literate Bronze Age is the upper stage of barbarism. And so, as you can see here, once you get, let's see, engineering, and let's see, once you get the horse and monarchy, then you get feudalism, right? So there's this idea that there's this sort of technological buildup of civilizations. And if we're to take Morgan's abstract classification seriously of the world, we might call the Gilded Age a new technologies about sugar that are emerging. It's helpful to understand these three stages, though. Let me go back to them, because they're used by lots of people in this time: the savage, barbaric, and civilized civilizations. And he says that there are the basically, if you look around the world in the 1870s or the 1880s, that there are savage societies, that there are barbaric societies, and there are civilized societies. And so, this is where we get kind of Eurocentrism, perhaps. And that's Morgan's way of understanding the world, that civilization is just a kind of collection of these technologies. But if we're going to talk about a technology that's really important, I'll go back to the one that, Ashland, thanks. I'm going to go back to the one that I'm obsessed with. Well, I'm obsessed with wheat, but I'm also obsessed with sugar. And if we're going to use this abstract classification, we might call the Gilded Age and Progressive Era the age of a sugar-using people. One of the things that's distinctive about the industrialization of the United States is its insane consumption of sugar. Sugar consumption seems to be an important indicator of industrial development in the United States. It's best to remember that sugar is, of course, used in sweets. It's of course, demonstrates that you have more access to food. If lots and lots of people are eating sugar, it means that they have spendable money. But sugar is also really an industrial product. It's really important to understand that you get the sort of canned food and fruits using refined sugar. And this is crucial for understanding basically how you can survive in very distant rural places, even in the mountains where there aren't a lot of other kinds of food. And it's the use of tin and aluminum later to package these foods. Some anthropologists have suggested that sugar and coffee that are used in growing amounts by workers is connected with the work pace that moves when we move away from rural work and towards a place where you're punching in and punching out a time card. Then certain kinds of things like coffee and sugar and tobacco, right, get you going, right? They're stimulants that are important so that you can work at a frenzied pace for a 10-hour day or a 12-hour day. When you walk over to the Starbucks and get your Frappuccino, you're getting your coffee, you're getting your sugar, all of those things which allow you to work at a frenzied pace for concentrated, frenzied work. And they speed up the heart. They briefly restore energy, though over the longer term they lead to exhaustion. And so the end of a workday, you're exhausted. So sugar is also probably connected with industrialization in another sense, which is that people who are working in an environment where they are working 10 hours or 11 hours or 12 hours a day increasingly need sugar and coffee just to stay awake and keep working at this feverish pace on assembly lines and things like that. Canned foods are also the key to commercial supremacy in Europe. All sorts of American canned foods become staples for urban workers in Britain. They're also used in the settler colonial regions with European immigration that struggle to feed themselves. This is places like Canada at first, Australia, and Argentina. All Canada, Australia, and Argentina also draw European settlers the way the United States does, but they also rely on canned foods to basically move into a region, have people support themselves, and then establish these other sorts of things. Industrial drug usage in the 50s in modern-day China. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I bet it is. Yeah, that stimulants are a kind of model, I think, of economic development. The person who makes that argument is in a book called Sweetness and Power, Sidney Mintz. He's died a few years ago. But yeah, I think you actually could use it as a sort of index to industrialization, particularly in places like China where official records are actually not always reliable. Okay. So these canned foods then are exported to Europe, primarily Britain. Britain is the #1 consumer of American canned foods, but it's also consumed in Canada, Australia, Argentina. 1984, George Orwell wrote that the canned food is more of a killer of workers than the machine gun, because George Orwell, who was from a sort of moderate to upper middle class family, a sort of lower middle class family, believed that all this canned food that workers were eating in Britain and Manchester and others elsewhere were contributing to all sorts of malnourishment problems. U.S. sugar consumption increases over 1,500% from 1800 to 1900, a 15-fold increase. And, as we said before, there's little cane sugar produced in the United States, and the result is the growth of two dependent economies that are in sugar growing regions, Hawaii and Cuba. And we talked before about how the McKinley Tariff, which was initially designed to hurt one person, Klaus Spreckels in California, actually hurt all the Haole plantation owners in Hawaii, who then pushed for revolution and annexation. Even before the revolution, though, those Haoles pressured King Kalakaua to turn over Pearl Harbor to the American Navy as a coaling station. The protectionist Republicans were upset about sugar because it made for the surplus. They supported tariffs, and they altered the tariff to eliminate the surplus. And then, as we saw previously, it led to a fiscal crisis in 1893. In 1894, the Democrats basically retaxed the sugar. Yes, it's 15,000% is from 1800 to 1900, so it's basically a 15-fold. Sorry, not 50. Yeah, 1,500% is, and it's 15 times. So sorry, I probably threw those together, but it's a 15-fold increase, which works out to a 1,500% increase, if that makes sense. Okay. The Democratic Congress reimposes a tax on sugar in 1893, and basically because now Hawaii is a protectorate, that means that Cuba is the only place that's being taxed for its raw sugar. So the raw sugar coming from Cuba puts Cuba at a disadvantage compared to Hawaii, which is thousands of miles away. Hawaii is getting all these other subsidies, including travel subsidies and things like that, because it's now a protectorate after 1891 or so. And so Cuba then faces a serious financial downturn after 1893 when the tariffs get reimposed. Cuban nationalists, and so basically it destroys the Cuban economy. Cuban prices drop about 50%. Cuban nationalists respond to this crisis by calling for Cuban independence movement of 1895. They used dynamite to bomb railway stations and destroyed parts of the island. The Spanish government responded to this. So remember that Cuba is still a Spanish colony at this point. And so it's still a colony of Spain. And so Spain sends over this dude, General Valerian Weyler, who, as you can see, has got lots and lots of medals. And he had been in the Philippines before. Before the Spanish-American War, the U.S. and Spain are basically allies. The alliance grows closer in the 60s and 70s after Cuba ends slavery, because there had been some tension there between the U.S. and Spain over the issue of slavery. So basically, the U.S. and Spain are more or less allies. I'm trying to think of what Spain provides cork and wine and a lot of other things. So there's pretty strong trade between the U.S. and Spain. So Spain is more or less an ally. Valeriano Weyler responds with reconcentration camps, basically to separate the rebels from the areas of support. And these reconcentration camps are ugly. There aren't a lot of images from this, and so sorry these images are somewhat grainy, but this is to give you a sense of the reconcentration camps. It was to separate nationalists from their base of support. He also regularly tortured people who he suspected of being nationalists. And these reconcentration camps basically take people away from their agriculture, the things that they're producing, away from sugar plantations and things like that, puts them in these camps, puts fence around them and stuff like that, and people starve. They don't get enough food. And so very much like the concentration camps in the Holocaust, concentration camps in the Holocaust were designed to kill people. This is not designed to kill people, but these concentration camps effectively do kill people by leading to starvation and other diseases that follow starvation. So it's estimated in in this regime that Weyler introduces in 1896 to try to put down the Cuban insurrection, it's estimated that 200,000 Cubans die from starvation or disease. This is about 12.5% of the population. And this, I suppose, you could compare to U.S. efforts to destroy Native American resistance, putting people on reservations and things like that. But intentional starvation, the U.S. did not directly engage in. People did starve on. I don't want to, suggest that American this resettlement of Native Americans was didn't lead to deaths. It certainly did. The Trail of Tears and things like that. But this is. As you can imagine, this is incredibly unpopular. It's very difficult to get any information about what's going on in Cuba. And in fact, Spain, to this day, has not released any of the information about the Governor General's regime. Spain is so embarrassed about what happened in Cuba in 1895 and 1896 that you cannot go to the archives in Spain and access anything, or very much, about that regime of 1896. But it is, by most accounts, a pretty horrible attempt to put down this revolution, this attempted revolution or nationalist revolution. So, how does the U.S. respond? Let's talk a little bit about Republicans and Democrats. Now, McKinley is a sort of expansionist Republican. Republicans are somewhat divided on this. But this is the sort of image of that Republicans had of the world, which is the United States would have markets all over the world, and so saltwater imperialism, kind of taking over other countries and making them kind of forced markets, or is important. An open door to China is important, and so McKinley and some Republicans are strongly support a particularly a method of getting from the U.S. to China. Let's think about this a little bit. Now, the Panama Canal has not been built, so the U.S. to get to China from the East Coast has to go all the way around South America. As we move from sailing ships to steamers and things like that, you have to have coaling stations at various points to resupply. And so at this point, there's no place in Cuba where there's a coaling station. Yeah, actually, there is a connection between this and the Boxer Rebellion, because both of those are something like nationalist movements. The thing's a little bit different about the Boxers is that the Boxers do have the support ultimately, or relatively late, by the Queen Empress Dowager. So there is a kind of Chinese, but there is a sort of nationalism that's behind both of these things. The Boxers are complicated because we call it the Boxer Rebellion, but there's actually like a dozen different groups in China that are behind these anti-imperial moves. So it's similar, and of course it's happening right around the same time. So they're doing some of the same things, which is to try to cut off supply lines, blow up, or knock down railway terminals and stuff like that. Okay, so there are Republicans who support the idea, are interested in the idea of maybe making Cuba a colony because of the chaos seemingly that's happening in Cuba at the time, and there are reports. Cuba is relatively close, and so I'll just go to the next image. Cuba, as you can see, is quite close to the United States. Here's Cuba down here, here's the United States up here, and so there are steamers that are regularly going back and forth to Cuba, and so there are reports of what's going on. There are Democrats who also support imperialism, but for slightly different reasons. The supporters of intervention, some of them are Southern Democrats who believe that there should be a golden circle. Now, this golden circle idea goes all the way back to 1834, before the war. And, the U.S. had annexed Florida in 1819 and South Alabama in 1819, taken it from Spain. Texas had been taken from Mexico in the 1840s. California also in the 1840s had been taken from Mexico. And one of the issues that Southern Democrats, going all the way back to Jefferson Davis and his predecessors, back when slavery existed, was that there should be a golden circle with its center in New Orleans that would be a kind of plantation society that would produce all the cotton that would be exported around the world, or most of it. And so this golden circle. So there were lots of some people have said that the Knights of the Golden Circle are kind of predecessor of the Ku Klux Klan, but it was a popular organization in the South, particularly in places like Texas and Alabama and Mississippi. And so some of those Democrats, the war's over, slavery's over, but they still imagine plantation-style societies producing profitable sugar and cotton, possibly tobacco, for an international market, and they believe that the U.S. should be part of this. So there's still kind of Golden Circle believers, even though the Knights of the Golden Circle kind of falls away once slavery is abolished. There are people that oppose intervention. And the people who oppose intervention are interesting. They're also there's not a party that's on one side or the other side of this. There are some Republicans who support it and Republicans who oppose it, Democrats who support it and Democrats who oppose it. But there are others, black and white Republicans, for example, who opposed intervention in Cuba on humanitarian grounds. They said we shouldn't be annexing Cuba. This would be wrong to make it an empire. There were Republicans too who say they take a sort of traditionalist and racist position that Cubans are mostly black and they cannot be assimilated into American society, and so they shouldn't be helped because you'd have to make Cuba a state. You couldn't, protectorates are really not in the framework of the United States at this point, and they would have to be a state, and there's a sort of racist opposition to having more black people in the United States that some Republicans support. But there are others who are humanitarians who think, for other reasons, that it's just not a great idea to get involved in Cuba. And that includes people like Andrew Carnegie here on the left. John Quincy Adams is there. Who else is there? Atkinson, Hoare in the Senate from Massachusetts. Schertz, a former Republican who was supported Reconstruction. And so this group joined together in the Anti-Imperialist League. It included Mark Twain. It included Andrew Carnegie. It included Samuel Gompers. Carnegie, yeah, that's a good point. I would talk about that, but basically there's this transition that happens where the U.S. gets more and more behind annexation. Yes, exactly, and I'll talk about that too. So the Anti-Imperialist League, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, who's the head of the AFL, also the so-called isolationist Republicans. But as you see here at the top, quicksand of public opinion, or the bottom there, quicksand of public opinion, I guess you can't really see that because of the way I look. Quicksand of public opinion. There does seem to be a shift in views, and this is around 1899. So, but before I talk about what actually happens there, I want to talk a little bit about imperialism so that we understand what it is and what the context is. Because a lot of people throw around the term imperialism, but I don't think they fully understand imperialism. So a lot of American historians, when they talk about imperialism, it's when I read this stuff, I think, God, you don't know what you're talking about. So let me just talk about what European imperialism looks like. One part of that is a scramble for Africa. Starting around the late 1870s, there's really a push by European countries, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy, to take parts of Africa after about 1874. There's a Berlin Conference of November 1884 to 85, which some people say is the beginning of the scramble for Africa. But in Germany's case, for example, most of those territories are actually acquired before 1884, so really in the 1870s. But there really is a push by European states to sort of grab parts of Africa and make them part of their empires. The other place where this is happening is Asia, and it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but if you see R, J, J, F, those, and then little brackets around them, basically France, Germany, Japan, Russia, the Netherlands, each of them is sort of grabbing parts of Asia, China, as they see the Chinese empire getting weaker and weaker, and they grab what they call spheres of influence. So if you see up here in where the R is, that Russians take Manchuria, they go all the way to here, and then the Japanese push them back. What's a little bit different about this is we've got a Japanese empire here for the first time. So it's not just a Western European empire. Japan is also an imperial power, and it's developing very, very rapidly, getting battleships and all these other sorts of things. So that when we talk about imperialism in Europe, we also need to recognize that Japan is an imperial power, Russia is an imperial power, things that you don't ordinarily think of when you think of empire. It's not just Britain, it's not just France, it's not just Spain and Italy. The third thing that's happening is the carving of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, it does. It does, and in part that going back to, I'll talk about that next in this class. But yeah, it's really important that Japan actually is a powerful empire. I want to talk about the Russo-Japanese War a little bit later, but yeah, it's important that Japan is a successful empire, and it sees itself really in the same way that European empires see themselves. They've got all those technologies. Back to Lewis Henry Morgan, they've got all those technologies, and therefore they're highly imperial and highly advanced. Ottoman Empire is also being carved up in this period. You could say that that goes back all the way to, I don't know, 1770s or so, but there's a kind of rush to grab parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so as you see, there's the Russian Empire is taking chunks, Italy is taking chunks, Greece separates from the Ottoman Empire in 1820 and then starts taking chunks as part of its expansion. And then we've got separate nations that are emerging, like Serbia and Montenegro and Albania and others. So what we see here is those are all imperialism. So if we just go back, the carving up of Africa, the spheres of influence in Asia, and the carving up of the Ottoman Empire in what we'd call now the Middle East. All three of those things are going on in the Gilded Age, in the period that we're talking about. And the U.S. sees itself as not engaging in that kind of junk, right? They see themselves as not being that, whether they are or not. There's a lot of language among both Republicans and Democrats that say we're not going to be an imperial power like that. And when they're talking about imperialism, they're talking about this. So there's tech that makes the imperialism possible. And it's really important to understand the technology. And this actually helps explain why Japan leaps to the front of imperial powers. There are three pieces of technology that make the European imperialism possible and are going to be necessary for understanding America's empire in Spain. Oh, right, I didn't know that. Interesting. Just on that topic, the Dreadnought, and the predecessor to the Dreadnought. One piece of tech that's really important is something called the protected cruiser. It first starts out in 1883 and extends until 1986. It's replaced in 1906, and it ends. The protected cruiser is basically replaced by what's called the Dreadnought. Now, this tech is really important because it allows one ship. A protected cruiser moves fast. It moves about 25 knots. At sea, which is incredibly fast compared to other ships. And so other sailing ships and even steamships and things like that cannot move nearly as fast as the protected cruiser. A whole lot of the energy is devoted to, this is coal energy at this point, is devoted to speed. Number two is armor. It's very low to the ground, as you can see, low to the water, as you can see. And this protection is lots and lots of steel plates that protect it from attack. And then at the top, there's a kind of rotating artillery platform that allows you to produce massive shells, send massive shells into other ships. So we can't really understand, these three events, the partition of Africa, the spheres of influence in Asia, the carving up of the Ottoman Empire, without understanding the power of these ships. And they cost an insane amount of money. They cost around $2 million and this is in 1900 US dollars. It may be that, no, there's just one super long ship, basically. It's one super long ship, and it moves incredibly fast. And so it's really important to understand how this happens. The European powers, which have much more capital, much more effective taxation structures, largely through income tax and things like that, which the U.S. adopts relatively late, is able to generate the capital that makes it possible to make these protected cruisers. It is an American ship, yes. And so the Americans produce a protected cruiser in 1883 and all the way up forward. It's interesting about the cruisers because it's not really obvious why the U.S. needs a massive navy, although you could argue that, basically what protects the United States from other invading powers is basically a big ocean, and so it makes more sense to spend its money on an ocean. But the Republicans also believe in spending that surplus as much as possible. They really want the tariff, and so they believe that the Navy should get lots and lots of money as a way of absorbing that tariff money so that nobody complains about the tariff. So the U.S. does create a lot of battleships, the Great White Fleet that goes to Japan and places like that. But Europeans are spending an insane amount, and these cruisers are basically what allow European countries to dominate the Ottoman Empire, the Qing Empire, that's China, and Africa, much of Africa. Number two is the Gatling gun, and the Gatling gun is really important. It's massively important because it's basically an anti-personnel gun. This has to be either mounted on a platform, or as you see here, on wheels or something like that, and then held in place just like artillery or something like that. And it fires hundreds and hundreds of bullets per second, and this basically allows you to wipe out others. So this is what allows the Germans, the sort of British, to take out the Zulus in the Zulu War. It allows the Germans to take out the Hereros in the Herero War. These Gatling guns, if you're pistols and rifles against spears, for example, in Africa, you're sort of person to person. There's an advantage, but there's not a great advantage. Gatling gun provides 100-person advantage suddenly, which allows you sort of anti-personnel matters. And the Gatling gun is really important for understanding the pacification of these regions. I use pacification obviously with quotes around it because it's horrible what it does, just obliterates people. The third tech, it's not one that you necessarily think of, but is really important, and that is disease control campaigns. Sleeping sickness, yellow fever, and malaria are, there's all this exploration. We talked about Gilded Age science. This is Louis Pasteur in the back. Is sort of trying to figure out where all these things come from. And these are tropical diseases, sleeping sickness, yellow fever, and malaria, that had previously prevented European empires from invading places like China, in places like the Middle East, places like Africa. If we think about the three sort of places where this expansion is taking place, they're all taking place near the equator, and it's European states that their ability to control these diseases, which they had not been able to control previously, that allows them to colonize. Also plague, syphilis, and tuberculosis. Those aren't necessarily tropical diseases, but the discovery about how to take care of them makes occupation easier. Plague is a serious problem with any occupation. Syphilis, of course, is also, which I've misspelled, is also a serious problem connected with, right? Oh, maybe I did misspell. I don't know how it's spelled. Oh, no, that's just underlined. Okay. And tuberculosis also. And so the discovery about how to deal with those sorts of things. So that's important. So let me just recap. We've talked about the technologies that allow Europe to dominate places that are along the equator, that they previously hadn't been able to dominate them before. A lot of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, really hate this thing. They think it's horrible and genocidal. And then there's something called European jingoism or European imperialism. And I want to talk a little bit about European imperialism as an ideology, because again, this is helpful to understand that public opinion question that Jacob Hall was asking. How does American public opinion change? The key innovator here is Benjamin Disraeli, conservative prime minister in England, who takes power in 1874. His Conservative Party takes power in 1874. He promotes the English Empire. Now, the English Empire goes back a long ways, but he believes that there's a kind of broad benefit to Britain's of empire, even when it's expensive, even when empire is expensive. And he defends empire. He says it's a defense of Britain and those sorts of things. And when critics, the liberals, who are critical of Disraeli use the term imperialism in a new way. So previously, the word imperialism is old, and initially it meant military government. So Caesar was imperialist, right, in that old sense. Imperialism in the new sense, after 1872, after Gladstone's 1872 speech at the Crystal Palace, imperialism comes to describe this Gladstonian idea of stirring up Britons to support the Conservative Party on behalf of an idea of British imperial importance, and we need to bring civilization to these other people. Now, who criticizes Disraeli? Liberals, who are free traders, say imperial expansion is too costly and it doesn't have any benefits. And so they're among the first people who coined the term or use the term imperialism to describe Disraeli and the conservatives. Marxists also, the Social Democrats and others, say imperialism is the result of capitalism. They have a different explanation for this. This is the highest stage of capitalism for Lenin and will result in wars and revolution. So imperialism is a horrible thing. Now, jingoism, people use the term jingoism. I just want to give you a sense of where that term comes from. And this goes back to imperial conflicts between Britain and Russia in the Middle East. So there's seem to be some sense of encroachment in Central Asia. And there's this song that's basically drummed up at Trafalgar Square. We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. We've fought the bear before, and if we're Britain's true, the Russians shall not have Constantinople. So the rhythm totally gets lost with Constantinople. But that's where jingo comes from. So jingoism is a term for the criticism of people like Disraeli who stir up people on behalf of empire, on behalf of these imperial adventures, like in the Middle East, like in China, like in Africa. Even though, if you did a kind of cost-benefit analysis that empire doesn't matter that much, it provides a social benefit that helps particular parties. So historians refer to this as social imperialism. So basically, an empire is stupid because you don't actually get that much when you take over Northwest Africa or these other places. If you do look at the costs of these dreadnoughts and things like that, cost of these Gatling guns, all of the death and destruction that comes with these imperial wars in this period, there doesn't seem to be much benefit. But the benefit is social and the benefit is political, in that it creates the sort of support for conservatives in power. People like Disraeli, who's a conservative, is very, very worried about workers. And so he finds that workers are keen on this idea of empire. Okay, so now back to American imperialistic ideas, just to kind of give you a sense of where imperialism comes from. The term imperialism refers to a sort of drumming up of support, often among workers and others, for national expansion. Okay, so what they now need to talk about is yellow journalism and get back to Jacob's other question, which is about Japan. So Britain and France both help the Japanese military train, and they also provide and sell battleships to Japan. And the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, the Japanese Navy fights China over the control of Korea, and that little area up here, which is the peninsula, which is Manchuria. It's basically Manchuria. That Manchurian Peninsula, they fight over this, and they install a pro-Japanese leader in Korea. And they also claim this region. Now, shortly after this, Japan is forced to give it up. But this is what Japan is capable of doing with all of this battle tech. And what is it? It's Gatling guns. It's not dreadnoughts, but these protected cruisers and things like that. Basically destroy the Chinese fleet in 1894 and 1995. Kaiser Wilhelm, who watches this, worries about this, and he coins the term Die gelbe Gefahr, which is the yellow peril, or the yellow danger, or the yellow menace. Gefahr is one of these weird words that's not easily transferable. The yellow danger, or the yellow menace. He says he's concerned that back to Lewis Henry Morgan, that some foreign power that's not European has suddenly got access to all this tech and now is claiming to be a civilized society. So this Morgan idea is, he says, is very, very concerning. And so we see this the Yellow Danger, first serialized in 1898. Empress of the Earth, Tale of the Yellow War is a sort of fear that if Japan or China or gets this technology, that they're going to basically be able to control the world. And then the Yellow Menace becomes, weirdly, in the New York world first, R.F. Uko's Yellow Kid, which is a kind of cartoon character. He's probably the first comic book character. And he's this sort of vaguely Asian-looking guy who is sort of a symbol of the newspaper. And so this newspapers then that become very, very popular in the 1890s, they become very cheap to reproduce newspapers in this period, is called, partly because of the Yellow Kid, yellow journalism. So yellow journalism is basically jingoistic journalism. It's journalism that's devoted to sort of propping up or supporting American imperial adventures, in part because it's very popular. It becomes very popular among workers and others. And so the two heads of this, the two leaders of this, are William Randolph Hearst. One of you guys did Hearst in your biography, and the other is Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. It's where we get the Pulitzer Prize from. And the New York Journal and the New York World become very, very popular newspapers in this period. And they, as you can see, they have pictures in them, including pictures of, and this is a Spaniard search women on American steamers, and this is the sort of stuff that's being shown here is that the threat to Americans. White women are being treacherously used by the Spaniards in this period, the dark Spaniards. Now, the idea that Cubans are primarily white and Spaniards are primarily brown is just whatever. But in any event, these yellow sheets, as they were called, or yellow newspapers, report and make up stories of light-skinned Cuban women who are abused by dark-skinned Spanish troops. Hearst even sends a reporter to snatch a female rebel from a Spanish jail in Cuba in the reconcentration period and states that her only crime was defending her virtue against a Spanish officer. And so you get these kind of almost pornographic kind of depictions of Spanish abuse, and this is right at the same time we have this sort of pornography about no, they weren't, but it was, I'm not sure why. Actually, they probably thought, I'm not sure why they thought they were searching women on American steamers, but yeah, maybe they did think that they were carrying bombs or something like that. So we're back to, right, protect our white women. So this is really important, and it actually sells newspapers. The next provocation is then a letter from Dupuy de Lome, the Spanish minister of the U.S., that says McKinley is, quote, weak and a bidder for the admiration of the American crowd. So de Lome is basically referring to the growing popular movement about the support of U.S. intervention in Cuba and even annexation of Cuba. The letter is stolen and delivered to Hearst, where it makes the front page in 1896, I think, or 97. And then finally, so Teddy Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He brings the whole Pacific Fleet all the way to Cuba because he's concerned, or wants to, have a showdown with Spain, but he doesn't want to declare war, so he's just going to leave a bunch of ships around. The Maine is a battleship that comes near the harbor in Cuba, and sent to patrol the waters and intervene, if necessary, in the conflict between Spain and the Cuban rebels. It's blown up, and we still don't know why it's blown up. The explanation at the time, there's an inquest determines at the time in 1897 that it's blown up by a mine that's laid by the Spanish. In 1977, the U.S. Navy reinvestigated this and said There was no mine. The explosion was from within. That basically, that coal was probably too close to munitions, and the thing really blew up from the inside. But the story, as it's laid out in the New York Journal, is that Spanish treachery is behind the destruction of the Maine. In this case, so what do we make of this jingoism? What do we make of this nationalism? Republicans don't. A lot of Republicans are not all that keen on intervention. A lot of Democrats are not all that keen on intervention for different reasons. But you could argue that American men who are facing industrial changes undermine their control, including large-scale industrialization and corporate consolidation. Begin to enter a world where they're no longer alone. Improved communications, European adventures into Africa appear to make the world more unstable and interdependent. The way they respond in these newspapers is to see the world in black and white. Beautiful, light-skinned Cuban women attacked by dark-skinned Cuban men. Dark-skinned Spanish men. And this image of America as a protector of women against the sort of evil Spaniards is an explanation, or helps explain why people, yeah, right? Why people. So you thought I was making this shit up, right? But this is exactly what's going on here. Is they turn to the ideology of Anglo-Saxon and male pride. Yeah, it does. It's very different. I think U.S. imperialism is very different, in part because it's much more. A lot of the other things that we associate with imperialism don't quite work in the same way in the United States. I don't want to say the U.S. is not an imperial power, because it certainly is by the end, but it is different. Okay, so when we get the Battle of Santiago Bay, which is where this is basically how the Spanish-American War, which starts in 1898 and ends in this 3 months later, 4 months later, basically April to August. The Spanish-American War ends. It's mostly fought in harbors. So the whole story of the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt and whatever is basically garbage. This is really a war fought at sea, and it's all about gunboats. American ships in the Philippines and Cuba arrive, and they just make target practice of Spanish ships in the battle, quote unquote, of Santiago Bay. They kill hundreds of Spanish sailors at no cost to themselves. In the Battle of Santiago Bay, there were no casualties, no deaths. Well, one sailor died of sunstroke in Cuba, but otherwise no American deaths in the Battle of Santiago Bay. Hundreds of Spanish sailors died, and this is just really a difference in money. Basically, these ships, these $2 million ships, the U.S. has a bunch of them, and they basically, just a few of them make turn the Spanish fleet into target practice. Land forces are more uneven. It takes a while for the volunteer units organized under Teddy Roosevelt to defeat the Spanish. Spain surrenders, but Cuba is not even invited. The Cuban revolutionaries are not even invited to the bargaining table, and this leads to great tension in Cuba afterwards. The U.S. gets the Platt Amendment of 1901, where Cuba promises to provide land for American bases and to sign no treaties that the U.S. does not like. In the Philippines, I think I'm going to... Actually, I'm going to talk about the Philippines next week, because I don't have enough time. So this is Cuban, the sort of control of Cuba then emerges in this period, and U.S. control of Cuba emerges in this period. And Cuba is really arguably the first real American protectorate, in which there's no expectation that Cuba is ever going to have state privileges, even though it's going to be part of the United States. So they use this term protectorate, but it's basically an American colony, where there is sort of imperial control by the United States, but a kind of apparent sovereignty, a seeming sovereignty. Okay, so that's the end of the war, and it grows out of, as we saw before, American imperialistic ideas, which are a little bit different from European imperialism. Have a great break. We're going to talk about the Philippines on Monday, and relax. This is fun times. Oh, sorry, I can't talk about Calabrian. Thanks so much. Talk to you guys next week, and I'll talk about Calabrian in the next class. Thanks, everybody.